Hi, everyone. So you know what I haven't done in a while? A top 10 list. This is a top 11 list. There's a reason for that. I try not to rip off Doug Walker and his many works. I really do. But as I was looking over the subject material for this list, I realized I absolutely couldn't leave anyone off it. And that's basically why it is 11 and not 10. Nothing to do with One Step Beyond. So, what is this list even about anyway, now that I've piqued your suspense with the title and this random intro where I'm talking about why it's 11 not 10? Well, lately I've been seeing a lot of videos, well, basically because I've been browsing for this kind of thing, where people talk about their favorite fictional villains from movies, from cartoons, from video games, and I noticed there's not a lot out there about literary villains. You know, the bad guys and girls that haunt books. Now, I can't claim to have read every book under the sun. There are a lot of great books I have not yet read, and yet I feel compelled to try and add literature to this great online pool of the discussion of who great villains are. Now, there are a couple ground rules before I get started on this. Self-imposed ones I set for myself. Kind of think of it, that's one rule. No obvious choices. I'm leaving out the ones we all know are great villains, the ones you can already find on other top 10 lists. This list is completely hipster. You're not going to find anything from the classic canon. You are not going to find Count Dracula here. You are not going to find... Oh, goodness, who else? Mr. Wickham from Pride and Prejudice? Does he count as a villain? Never mind that. You're also not going to find, like, for more contemporary stuff. I know Lord of the Rings is only sort of contemporary, but still, you're not going to find Sauron here. You're not going to find Voldemort here. They have their big fan bases. They have people who are going to talk up their good points. I am going to talk about the ones that you probably haven't heard of, or that you have, and you're going to squee at the fact that they're even mentioned. There are only two on this list who I think are... No, scrap that. 3 mainstream villains who are from more popular works. And I'm going to point them out as they come up, because I just had to include them. There was no way I was leaving them off the list, despite the fact that they do have large fan bases and are pretty well known among geek communities. There is one more sort of rule I have, but it's more of a rule for you. This list contains possible spoilers for any and every book on it. I may hide details to try and preserve you for when you get to reading this book and you can have the full surprise experience, say if I've piqued your interest in any of these. Or, in order to describe why I like villain, I may have to give something away. This list is not scripted, which is probably a bad idea, so I don't really know right now. Well, that's all the rules, so let's get to it. Number 11 is truly my 11th favorite of the hipster-ish literary villains. I could have kicked him off the list, but he represents something very significant to me in this term, despite the fact that there are 10 villains who I like better than him, and that's why this list is 11. He is also one of the 3 who is more well-known because he's from an extremely popular work of literature, despite the fact that that work of literature is almost universally panned. Even I don't like the book, but I do have to admit that I really do enjoy Aro Volturi from the Twilight Saga by Stephenie Meyer. Most specifically, he plays the most prominent role in New Moon. He also has a role in Breaking Dawn, but one of the biggest areas that the entire series failed was failing to give him his due justice in Breaking Dawn. So we'll concentrate on New Moon for now. I do not like Twilight as a book series. I do not think it is that well written. I do not think the characters are that engaging. And I think it has several societal problems. Things that I don't want our society to emulate. But I will hold off on just completely ripping into Twilight. We all know the complaints. And I'm going to say there are things I enjoyed about it, and probably the biggest, most enjoyable thing about the series, and what I find to be what makes it worth sitting through and reading, is the villain, Aro Volturi, who sadly is only in 2 of the 4 books. It is established within the mythology of this world that vampires live under a certain pecking order, and that the Volturi family, who were kind of like the arch-vampire government, are in charge of making sure no one steps out of line. During the course of New Moon, Edward decides to risk revealing himself to the world as a vampire, as a way of committing suicide. Which is kind of silly. I can think of a ton of better ways to go. But, you know, we're going to roll with it because it allows the Volturi to get really introduced. When the Volturi do show up, they capture most of the protagonists and bring them back to their base, which is kind of like an underground city in the middle of Italy. Then, the Volturi, headed by Aro, immediately establish themselves as the most powerful vampires, and decide that they, in fact, want to capture the heroes and use their powers for the Volturi's own gain. They employ minions who can cause pain in others and who can do other unsavory things. Aro's power in particular is his ability to read every thought a person has ever had in their entire life simply by making physical contact with their skin. This is very dangerous, and of course, this scene in New Moon, when the protagonists confront him, is probably the most suspenseful in the entire story, as there is a good chance, if he touches the wrong person, he can end up finding out a lot of things that people don't want him to know. In Breaking Dawn, he almost ends up leading a large invasion upon the protagonist family, during which he intends to destroy them for breaking a transgression. Now, this is a spoiler I'm going to somewhat give out. I'm not going to say why, but the battle ends up just not happening, which is a shame because as vampires were built in this world to be superior physical fighters, and given Aro's cruelty and ruthlessness, it would have been really cool to see him legitimately pose a threat to the protagonists during the finale. And that's why I absolutely could not leave him off the list, because as much as I don't like these books, I find him an incredibly engaging, if only short-lived, symbol of intimidation and suspense. Number 10. What do you call a literary villain that preys on other books? Literally. Well, I guess you'd call him Capricorn from Inkheart by Cornelia Funk. We are not going to touch the sequels to this book as I thought they were far inferior, and that's largely because they couldn't create as compelling of a villain. Capricorn, well, he knows he's in a book within a book. The protagonists of the story have a book which is in-universe called Inkheart, and they accidentally find a way to bring him out of that book and into their world. He was the villain of his story, and a tyrannical dictator to boot. He then decides to spend his time, first of all, burning all the other books he can find, and second, using the same power that brought him out of his book to try and read himself treasure and wealth out of others, such as the Arabian Nights or Treasure Island. He effectively sets up his own dictatorial regime in the middle of Europe without really being noticed by anyone that he doesn't want to attack. No one outside really knows that a supernatural force has emerged and is basically burning entire worlds contained within the pages of other books. Although he is making a mark on the reality he has entered. He's gathering forces, gathering power, capturing victims and tormenting them. Altogether, it's a really cool concept just to think about, what if villains in stories became self-aware and decided to enact their roles in reality? And that's basically what Capricorn is. Number 9. Here's a riddle for you. What's part human, part demon, never really clearly explained, but pure evil, and has a saucy attitude to boot? Randall Flagg, the embodiment of all that is evil, from the novel The Stand and the series Dark Tower, all by Stephen King. Flagg's role is probably more prominent and has more character depth in The Stand, where a plague has overtaken Earth, and of the survivors that remain, one person in the whole world represents all that is good, and most of the survivors rally around her, whereas another person, Flagg himself, represents all that is evil, and he gains a number of cult followers that decide to attack the good camp, if you will. So it's a fairly simplistic binary, but it's pulled off effectively. Flagg is portrayed as a young murderer with an attitude. If there's something bad to be done, he's not above doing it. He uses other characters as pawns. He tricks a certain character who's been bullied all his life into believing, and even stating before he does the act, that he is making an attack of his own free will, when in fact Flagg is engineering it. He lures in another follower by basically becoming her soulmate and convincing her that he's the one she's meant to be with for life, when she's really just one in a list for him. It's also worth noting that he's described physically as being young, attractive, and basically everything that would not raise suspicion if he was walking down a normal street. He's perceived physically as a human being and not as a demon, which is all the more frightening. In the Dark Tower, his role is given more of an expanded feel to it. Instead of just ruling over a cult, he actually has influence over an entire world and is messing with several characters on several different levels. He's even at one point given a kind of a connection to the Wizard of Oz, basically equating himself with the wizard, and speaking from the Emerald City Palace. He torments the protagonist by chasing him through... yeah, here comes a big spoiler. Through several cycles of time. The hero has had to deal with him time and time again. Flagg kidnaps various members of the party, especially Susanna when she's pregnant with a child who is either the savior or the destruction, and puts them through torment. However, during the end of the series, his role is sort of relegated to that of the dragon, while the Crimson King takes over as the big bad, and generally, Dark Tower fans, myself included, tend to agree that the Crimson King made a terrible villain. He sort of acted as an invisible hand. He didn't really do much. He didn't have a definite personality. All he really did was order Flagg around. Flagg was the much more dynamic character and much more epic to watch.